They're afraid of the failure because that means they failed. And if they fail, they could lose their job. And so what do? They frantically grasp after the subjective, after the not measurable things. All they know is what you're doing isn't right because outcomes aren't being achieved. You're doing it wrong and you got to fix it. So they hover. But they hover over things that are not measurable. And then the people are confused. And the people feel that. And the people are like, well, what does success look like? And the managers can't give them that metric. And so you're in this constant state, I think, of grasping and frantically grabbing at things that don't exist, like measurable KPIs. And they get coined micromanagers. What do you think? That's my opinion.
No, I think you touched on so many things that I think are absolutely accurate. And it's funny, in that 20% manager that you mentioned, that like just a bad manager who just doesn't get it, I would argue that a lot of that 20% is really insecure, right? They're afraid of failure and they don't know how to defend failure on their team, and that kind of bubbles into it. And I would totally agree with that assessment. And the 80% that don't have the rails, one of the biggest things I coach leaders on is you have to understand the goals and objectives of your organization and how your team fits into those. If you can't answer that single question, your team will fail. Hands down, every time. Welcome back to this episode of Secrets of the Career Game. So many people are trying to navigate a corporate world that is laden with secrets, cleverly hidden, and unspoken rules to a game that most employees don't even know that they're playing. On this podcast, we try to give you a peek behind the curtains and some tips and tricks to ultimately make you successful in your career and help you progress a little bit faster. We are talking about building great leadership culture with Garrett Delph. I'm so excited to have Garrett on the podcast. He is the founder and the Chief Clarity Officer of Clarity Ops LLC. He is a serial entrepreneur, has an established track record of founding these successful international businesses that have collectively generated over $50 million in revenue. And his new generation business solutions are created for leaders who need, faster, easier, more profitable ways to step up and scale their businesses. So we're really excited. Welcome, Garrett. It's great to chat with you.
Thanks, Kendall. Really happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Why don't you get our audience up to speed? Tell them a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got to where you are now. Obviously, you've had a very successful, very dynamic route to ending up where you are. So love to get everybody a little more information about it.
Yeah, happy to share. So I was kind of an accidental entrepreneur, went to college, went the corporate route. I was thankful for that, actually. I learned a ton by being around, really smart people. But at the end of the day, after about a decade of that, I just really hated it. I hated it. And I knew two things. I didn't want to work for anybody else. And I knew I wanted to do my own thing, even though I didn't know what that was. So cashed in my 401k, all 13 grand. I was like, I'm rich. And then just began to kind of explore about like things that I loved. I launched a couple little side projects that made some money for me. But ultimately, I had always loved photography. Even though I'd never owned a camera. I was like that. I'd go to art exhibits and just love photography. So I bought a camera and started shooting everybody, everything. And that turned into kind of like people would say, hey, will you shoot my photos? I was like, of course I will. I mean, could we hire you? I was like, of course. So that turned actually into me becoming a professional wedding photographer. And grew a studio over the course of about 8 years, a nationwide brand, about 10 photographers on staff. We were shooting internationally too. And I learned a ton. Mostly I learned that taking photos was the 1 percentile and running a business is the other 99%, which I did not know was coming. That led me into 2005, where there was a true inflection point in the market. The film labs died. There's this big shift to digital photography. And overnight, if you were a photographer, you became the lab too. So you had to process all of your own digital photos. It was a nightmare and not scalable. So I solved my problem there through a series of steps. And then I had an epiphany. And that epiphany was, oh my gosh, like this is going to happen worldwide to every digital photographer that's professional. So connected with a couple of buddies, and we launched the world's first digital photo lab to the market. And that led me on a fascinating journey of building and scaling people and product worldwide. It also turns out, I didn't know at the time, but in order for that business to succeed, it needed to be a tech company. So I was thrown into the cesspool of AWS and tech. Learned a ton. And so about 5 years ago, through that entire journey of lots of failure and some good success too, I ended up building a kind of suite of operational tools that really worked in a reoccurring way over time, irrespective of whatever operational challenges would come our way. We could go back to our sort of library of frameworks, systems, tools, techniques, and solve them. And my epiphany 5 years ago was, oh my gosh, like this is kind of a superpower. This is magic. And there's nothing in the market out there that does that for business owners, especially in kind of the small medium realm. And that was really the impetus for launching Clarity Ops. As business owners, we typically don't have time, and we usually don't have the money to slow down and stop and focus on operational infrastructure and architecture. And so we do what everybody does. We focus on revenue and create a bunch of demand, and then we struggle to supply because we're all broken on the inside. And so Clarity Ops takes these frameworks, we call them FAST system, and it empowers business owners to take all the 20 years of building tools on my side to literally lift and shift these solutions straight into their org without having to slow down and without having to dump a ton of money and time and resources into figuring out operational frameworks, which turns out pretty complex. That's why most people don't do it. And so here we are. My goal is to put a dent in the 9 in 10 businesses fail stat by helping businesses with these frameworks recoup their gross profit and prepare for scale.
I love that. And it's so true what you mentioned. If you go into business to do a skill or to supply a product or to give a service, and then 99% of your time is spent running said business, which is a totally different skill set and not something anybody teaches you. And I talk about this a lot with fellow entrepreneurs who've been on my pod or who I know personally. We're all just taking messy action. Like nobody knows what to do. And to your point, I love the phrasing, like we're all broken on the inside a little bit because every business behind the scenes, especially in the early days, is like one person grinding it out. Then if they build a team, do they know how to build a team? Do they know who the right people are to hire, how to scale them? So I love what you're bringing to the market. And it's very much in line with what we talk about here on Secrets of the Career Game, which is what are all the things nobody teaches you about being successful at your career? It'd be great if somebody just had a blueprint for that, right? Yeah. So I love that we're going to jump into some of these topics.
Yeah, me too. Love it.
One of the big pieces here, especially for any of our people leaders who are listening, is building a team that can do the operations effectively. So how do you generally organize, your management teams for speed, for efficiency, for operational success, right? You're doing a lot in a short period of time. You're pivoting with the market. How do you build those scalable organizations?
Yeah, it's a really great question, Kendall. And by the way, I wanted to comment on your thought about how like the domains, the marketplace doesn't teach us founders, C-suite, and all layers in the org chart how to do this stuff. I mean, frankly, even MBA programs, they teach a lot of the what, the strategy, but nobody touches the operational how. And I just think what you said was really profound because I see it to be very true. Regarding your question on speed, efficiency, and scale.
Thank you for tuning in to today's episode. If you're finding the information on this podcast helpful and you're looking to take control of your career and start to elevate yourself to the next level, go ahead and check out our course. Go to bit.ly/career coach course to get signed up today and to start taking your career to the next level and navigate the secrets of the career game.
I define efficiency under kind of these two buckets, speed and quality. And so in terms of tackling speed and quality through an efficiency lens, I have 4 basic steps. Define expected goals and outcomes. Those need to be razor sharp clear because you cannot manage what you cannot measure. You want to define who's responsible for achieving those goals and outcomes. So there need to be owners vertically and horizontally throughout the org so that embedded in there you have accountability. And then another critical step, which, just us businesses, we really tend to leave out, and that is the instructions and the recipes. So you have to define all the recurring activities needed for those goals and outcomes and their corresponding measurable benchmarks. If you think about like auto manufacturing, you got all of these things that have to be done in this assembly line of activities from A to Z. And imagine if on the manufacturing floor in the assembly line, you weren't told how long you have to assemble the lug nuts on the rims and the tires of the car, but you got to go at your own pace, or whoever you were, you get to decide how long. You'd have a train wreck. And so you have to establish benchmarks for every activity along the assembly line journey of your product or service, as it relates to both speed and quality. And then execute, support, and measure. Like execute, support, and measure, and iterate. So those are sort of like the 4 macro steps for, from my view, achieving ultimate efficiency as it relates to speed and quality in your outcomes. And then scale, then how do you scale that? Scale will always be a function of supply and demand. And so first, for scale, you need to know where you're going, or hopefully you will. But if you have some planning mechanisms in place, you want to forecast your future outcomes. And then based on those forecasts, you capacity plan your supply based on the forecasted outcomes. And then from there, you use the speed and efficiency framework, which I mentioned a second ago, to related to the capacity analytics. And then you derive from there your future forecast needs. So that's 120 seconds, real quick overview of how I would approach that engine of success.
Yeah, I love that. And there's a few really specific things you touched on, Garrett, that I want to double down on. So one is that a lot of your success actually starts at the point where you set expectations, right? So if you're a leader in a company, or you're a C-suite, or even if you're just managing a team for the first time, a mistake I see a lot of leaders make is we don't set clear expectations when we assign work or we assign tasks. We give a lot of autonomy and a lot of freedom with that, which can be good. But if there's not enough clarity in our expectation, odds are that person's going to fail, because we always think our own ideas are the best and the way we would do it is the best way. And so if they do it the second best way and we didn't set clear enough expectations, we have a mismatch, right? So I love that you touched on setting those expectations really clearly up front.
Yeah.
And then measuring how we follow through with those, right? When I see individuals give constructive feedback to their teams, or I see a leader come in and they're running an operation shop for the first time, when they don't have a way to measure that success, they end up giving feedback that's too nebulous, too vague to actually be actioned upon, right? One of the big ones I hear all the time is like, you really need to work on communication. I'm like, awesome. What does that mean? So nobody knows what that means. That is like a cop-out from a managerial perspective to say, hey, you need to work on communication, or you need to get more efficient. Those aren't measurable unless they're paired with good expectation setting. So I think both of those are really, really important. And it's funny that you talk about capacity and demand, because this is where I see big businesses fail, right? I've been in corporate for 15 years now. And I think every organization I've ever joined, only one of them already had a capacity and demand model in place. Every other one I've ever worked for, they're like, well, we don't know if we have enough people. I'm like, well, you better before you don't. Right? I'm not signing up to do $40 million worth of work with $10 million worth of people. Like, you're going to get burnout, you're going to get turnover, you're going to get frustration, you're not going to hit your goals. So I think this is really key, whether you are listening to this podcast as an entrepreneur who wants to start a business, or you're listening as somebody who runs a corporate team. Being able to create that efficiency, that scale, and then measure that capacity and demand really is what drives a business forward, or drives a leader to success.
Yeah. Yeah. I, uh, by the way, just 500%, I don't think that the world of business can hear that narrative enough.
Yeah.
And we just, we don't see all of the fatalities in business. We just see all of the new ones that show up, and we see all of the current press, but we don't see the 9 that die along the roadside because they didn't pay attention to these things that you're mentioning. And I really think mostly it's not product market fit that was missed, and mostly it's not, allocation of capital. I think mostly it is the engine room. It's the engine room that was never architected to support the speeds and the pressures that the business puts on the vehicle. And I keep seeing that break time and time again.
Yeah. I see it, within my own business, within working in corporate. I see it both places, right? So I think you've hit the nail on the head. And what's interesting about this is I feel like there's an equal or greater over pivot as well that we see, which is we have the people who are giving autonomy, they're not tracking the right things. And then we have the micromanager who's tracking everything to the end, but still has misses, right? So I'd love to get your take on why do we think micromanagement is really complained about so often on social media, or it's felt so often in the workplace?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. That's such a big topic. I feel like, that could be several podcasts alone. Yeah.
Many episodes of just us riffing on micromanagers. I love it.
So I've thought a lot about this one. I really have. And I tend to bucket the, coined micromanager into 2 buckets. The micromanager that is just, a bad leader and they're a control freak. They just got it wrong. I tend to think they are the 20%. Then the other bucket is the manager that actually wants to be great, and they want to do good, and they want to win. But the business didn't set them up with rails, and they didn't set them up with true KPIs that actually represent the outcomes that the business needs at the micro and the macro, that actually determines the success of any given role, no matter where they are in the org chart, where a manager can objectively say, okay, this is a mark of your success, and this is why we're hitting our outcomes and our goals, or we're not. I think that's where most managers live, but they don't have those rails. And so what they end up doing, I'd love to hear your thought on this. What I've seen is they're, irrespective of rails, which most of them don't have, they're still responsible for the failure. And that's they're afraid of. They're afraid of the failure because that means they failed, and if they fail, they could lose their job. And so what do? They frantically grasp after the subjective, after the not measurable things. All they know is what you're doing isn't right because outcomes aren't being achieved. You're doing it wrong and you got to fix it. So they hover. But they hover over things that are not measurable. And then the people are confused. And the people feel that. And the people are like, well, what does success look like? And the managers can't give them that metric. And so you're in this constant state, I think, of grasping and frantically grabbing at things that don't exist, like measurable KPIs. And they get coined micromanagers. What do you think? That's my opinion.
No, I think you touched on so many things that I think are absolutely accurate. And it's funny, in that 20% manager that you mentioned, that just a bad manager who just doesn't get it, I would argue that a lot of that 20% is really insecure, right? They're afraid of failure and they don't know how to defend failure on their team, and that kind of bubbles into it. And I would totally agree with that assessment. And the 80% that don't have the rails, one of the biggest things I coach leaders on is you have to understand the goals and objectives of your organization and how your team fits into those. If you can't answer that single question, your team will fail, hands down, every time. And the reason for that is we can say we're delivering a lot of great work, but if it's not driving the business forward, if it's not adding value, if it's not helping them elevate themselves, you're never going to get that return on investment. And I agree with you. I think that's where managers get their fingers in too many things. I need this. Or their boss is that way and they're trying to keep up with all their boss's questions. And so it just becomes this trickle down effect, right? So I definitely agree with your assessment. And I think if there's an ownership challenge we can put on the leader, there's, yes, your manager or your leaders may not have given you the guardrails. They may not have given you the goals. And I would argue in that situation that it's your job to come up with them and articulate them back up and say, hey, I think my goal is to deliver this impact. My goal is to deliver this in alignment with the company's goals. Because if you can't do that, your leadership's going to continue to devalue the work that your team does produce, whether they do it right or not. Right. And so I do think it's so great what you're drawing attention to is I hate to use this phrase because I feel like it's overutilized, but like there's a difference between management and leadership. I can manage anybody to deliver a report twice a week and drive them absolutely crazy in the process.
Yes.
To lead them to an impact, I got to know what impact we're leading to, right? And I've referenced this before on my pod. I lead a team and their number one goal is automation right now. Everybody knows If you ask anybody in my team and they didn't answer with automation, I would be very upset. Okay. They should all be at this point because we've increased the efficiency in our team 300% in 3 years. Right? We've been able to triple the volume of what we handle without adding any additional people. That's huge, right?
Huge.
That's the
huge.
goal.
Yeah.
But that goal didn't exist. Nobody told me that was my goal. I looked at the team and went, this isn't going to work. We got to get way more efficient, right? And so you have to be able to create that. And I think, this is one big aspect of what drives unhappiness at work. But there are so many other things that I think kind of weigh down on the individual. And that's why we're seeing, I talked about it on another podcast episode a few weeks ago, Gen Z, they're unhappy and they're like, I quit. Like, I'm not going to deal with it. And in some ways, I'm jealous of that attitude because I'm like, I got a mortgage, I got kids.
Yes.
But you sit so close to the operation and the leadership side of things. How do you think a business could work to lower stress of the employee and increase that happiness in their culture? In addition to clarifying these expectations and this impact, because I know there's so many other factors that go into that as well.
Yeah. Well, I think if you're going to have high happiness in an organization, you have to get rid of the things that cause unhappiness. And so confusion causes unhappiness. Lack of clarity causes unhappiness. Mismanaged expectations causes unhappiness. So I think the best way, and by the way, let's be honest. So I'm assuming we're talking about for-profit organizations here, yeah? So I think it's important to calibrate, because Gen Y got confused over this one, in my opinion, that business should be happy first and business second. So we have to remember the goal of a business is to grow and profit and succeed. Or whatever their success is, but typically there's going to be profit, unless you're blitz scaling and you're venture backed, and you got a 10-decade-long runway to lose money. Totally different story. And so, first and foremost, the business needs to value caring for its people, because great companies are always built by great people, and great people that stay and continually to succession plan up and grow in the business were managed well by the top in terms of demonstrated care. So how do you care? You make sure that your values are published, and you make sure that you say clear to the business and to the leaders, this is what we value. And based on those values, this is how we're going to behave. For example, we value accountability. And so you put in leadership agreements where leaders are going to uphold the value of holding people accountable for what they were hired to do. We value measuring, we value that. I think other really important value components, by the way, are we don't value gossip. We don't value lying. We don't value cheating. It's amazing to see what happens in a business when people are not murmuring and gossiping and backbiting and infighting, right? If leadership goes in there and says, oh, wait, hold on. We can't do that around here because it's cancerous. Suddenly happiness goes up, just a direct derivative of that one core value alone. Operationally, other things a business can do to care for the people, which will hockey stick happiness, is put career paths in place. Great way to demonstrate you care for the people. When you join our company, based on this role, your entry point, here are the next 3 opportunities for you if you achieve these milestones. And you could achieve that title with that much more pay. And then stick to it. Fantastic. I think I mentioned leadership agreements. I think that's really important. And then I could go on and on. I won't, but I'll say one other one. Bless them with process. Give them ingredients and instructions that get them from A to Z that are easy and fast to follow and very clear. You eliminate the confusion part of all of this stuff, happiness hockey sticks.
So good. Like, I want to add, but I also just kind of want to give snaps because I feel like you touched on so many great things.
There's so many.
And it's very true because the most unhappy employees I see have either stagnated without a clear reason why, right? Their career pathing wasn't in place or their manager didn't adhere to the career pathing that they'd aligned on. The processes are janky and inconsistent and bureaucratic and difficult, and there isn't enough supply to do them effectively.
Totally. Yeah.
Or there's toxicity, gossip, role mongering, scope stealing, frustration that's permeating an organization.
Yeah.
Whether intentionally or unintentionally. And so these things that you're mentioning, I do think directly contribute to the end employee's happiness. And I think a manager and a leader are responsible for caring for each of these. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on something, and I'm going slightly off topic here, but it's related. Yeah. I have a theory that every company has a ghost culture and a real culture. So the ghost culture is what's on the placard. It's the mission statement on the website. It's what HR gives you in your pamphlet on day one, if they still gave out pamphlets on day one. And it's what the CEO thinks the organization's culture is. And the bigger the company, the further I feel that ghost culture tends to be from the team culture, right? Because you get further and further away from those leadership agreements. You get further and further away from those values. But then every once in a while, there's a company whose culture matches exactly what the CEO thinks, all the way down to every team and all the way down to every employee's experience. And maybe that's not 100% of the time, but it's 80 or 90, which I would argue is pretty high in the modern age.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious if you think, one, I'd be curious if you agree with that a lot of companies have a ghost culture and a true culture. But then two, if it is true, what makes some companies land further from what they want their culture to be versus closer to what they're saying that it is?
Yeah. So I agree with you 500%. I'd say it's probably a 90-10, maybe even a 95-5 in terms of the 5% that uphold, the other 95% become ghost or legacy. And by the way, even with that 90 or 95%, I think there is a split buckets there. People that never actually even purposefully define culture. That's heavy lifting. And then the other that just become legacy. Like they had really good intentions, which is why all of the sayings ended up on the walls. We just, engaged with a new client up in Orange County here in Southern California, and we were in their boardroom. And in the boardroom, there were placards of their 10 values. And I was like, and this was in the middle of a conversation about infighting with their C-suite. And I was like, hey, I see you have your values all over here. When's the last time you guys updated those? And guess what the answer was? 8 years ago. It's really the last time they talked about them and evaluated, are these for the new age, and our future. So anyways, I agree with you. And then how do you solve it? I do think it's worthy of saying, you got to want it. Jeff Weiner, ex-CEO of LinkedIn, said something years back that still sticks with me to this day. He said, my job as the CEO is to be the chief reminder officer about where we're going and what we value. And he said, I am constantly, daily, many times a day, reminding all of our people, vertically and horizontally, about those two things. And he said, the moment I get tired of that is the moment I should no longer be the CEO. And so I think the stuff has to come from the top. And then the top, either through delegation or through DIY, needs to purposefully in perpetuity remind and enforce and iterate. Remind, reinforce, iterate. And I think that's how it happens. And that way, when old stuff, or, stuff from the past becomes legacy, when Gen Z shows up and says, I think you're an old guard and I'm not going to follow you, that won't happen because, or whoever's at the top has recognized going in, even before Gen Z showed up, they were like, Gen Z has new values. They value different things. And if we're going to partner with them, right, then we need to restructure for future success in both culture and business. I think that's how you do it.
You hit the nail on the head. That's great. I'm so happy because I talk about ghost culture all the time because I think it's a big problem, especially the larger the corporation. And I worked for a company, this was years ago, and their slogan was to do their business for the good of all, right? And it's great. Okay. It's on the website. Awesome.
Yeah.
I sat in meetings with VPs daily where a VP would go, is this the best thing for the customer? If you couldn't answer it and you couldn't justify it, you were dead in the water. And they asked that in every meeting, for every initiative, for everything we wanted to do. Is this the best thing for the customer? Does this change our business for good? And if you couldn't answer, you didn't do it. And it's the only company I've ever worked for that I really felt like what they said on the website, I heard in meetings. I heard VPs asking their teams. I heard managers leading their organizations. And when you see that consistency, to your point, you believe it. And you think, wow, I am really doing a good job. I am really doing what's right for the customer. I am emboldened to do creative things that fit this criteria. So I think you're right. I think you got to want it. I think you got to enforce it. And I think great leaders beget great leaders. If you're going to hire people who are good leaders, your culture is going to persist longer than if you're promoting based on tenure and not on skill, or hiring in people who maybe aren't the right culture fit, but have the right technical experience, right? You got to build that leadership tree the right way. So I love this.
Yeah, me too. What you said, based on, I'm paraphrasing what you said, so forgive me if I mess this up, but you said, okay, you've shown me and I believe it. And part and parcel to that is they also experience it because the culture and the leadership in the culture is doing what they said they would do. Like, that's how you get respect, and that's how you get buy-in. Great book called The $1 Trillion Coach about Bill Campbell. I think the most valuable lesson I learned from that book is Bill said, a great leader can only be a great leader if they were first a great manager. Because it's in management that you sharpen your muscles and your skills for being professional, for having empathy, for having integrity, you have proven and demonstrated you've earned your stripes as being a great planner and being able to move the needle and still respect the people. And he said, when you behave that way over time, people have no choice but to follow you, which makes you a leader. I thought that was really powerful. And it goes back to this thing of expectations management, good old fashioned, like stuff we learned in kindergarten, like do what you said you would do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really great. And I love when I see that, right? I feel like I hate to say that it's rarer than not, but it is somewhat rare to see these companies that have these really great permeated cultures and everybody who works there is really genuinely enjoying it. And so I think we've touched on so many good pieces of why that is today. So if somebody's listening, I always ask this at the end of the episode, if somebody's listening and they're like, man, I want to be a better leader. I want to help improve our culture. I want to drive our business forward. What's one tactical thing you would tell them they could go start doing tomorrow that would help them start to step into that better leadership or help them start to change the culture of their company in a positive way? 5
more podcasts, please, on that one.
Alrighty. We'll do a whole series.
I would, to be succinct, be objective about your business. Create the ability to manage and measure what you're building. And that only comes through infrastructure architecture. Getting clear about all the things we talked about today. I would encourage leaders to get help and don't do it alone. That is the biggest trap. Like, express about these values that you want to see so that you can help the team win, help the business win. And seek advisors, seek mentors, but build rails and build objective rails. I think that's my highest recommendation. And maybe lastly, I'll leave you with this little acronym we use at Clarity Ops. It's called P.I.E for leadership, which is be professional. Do what you said you're going to do. Have a great plan. Make sure you're clear on your plan as relates to the business goals and outcomes. Have integrity, right? Don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, don't gossip. Be respectful, and have empathy for your people. And, which is EQ. And respect them, give them grace, but also hold them accountable for what they've been hired to do. Those are my recommendations for leaders that are looking to break through and have success.
So awesome. Well, Garrett, it's been so great having this chat with you. If individuals are listening and they want to find out more about you, more about Clarity Ops, where should they go?
Yeah, thank you, Kendall. I'm on LinkedIn. Garrett Delph is my handle there. And then the website is clarityops.co. Couldn't get .com because it was like $50,000. And I didn't want to pay $50,000 for that, so I went with .co.
It's all right. I've gotten it for the same reason where I was like, man, 80 grand to be that careercoach.com.
Right.
That doesn't really seem like an ROI that I want to explore. No, so we'll definitely link both Garrett's LinkedIn as well as the website for Clarity Ops in the show notes. If you are interested, go ahead, check him out. If you have questions for him or for me, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Otherwise, give us 5 stars because I know you loved this episode. And then Garrett, I think we'll have to have you back for 6, 7, 12 more episodes where we talk about this stuff. But it was awesome having you on.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Would love to come back, of course. And I sure do appreciate the conversation.